Our guest joining us now is Rob Menard, and he is the director of the World Freeman Society. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
What is the mandate of the Freeman Society?
Well, essentially the mandate of the Freeman Society is we're looking for less government, less intrusive government, greater freedoms, and essentially the ability to exercise the rights that our forefathers fought, killed, and died for in previous generations.
And you're looking to do that through what sorts of actions?
Well, essentially what we do is we embrace the law instead of just blindly obeying and doing what the government wants us to do. We actually sit down, read the acts and the statutes, figure out that a lot of them are not automatically applicable as laws unless you voluntarily take steps that grant consent.
But we're talking about things like you don't want to carry photo ID, you don't want to pay tax.
I wouldn't say I don't want to pay tax. Most people have no problem paying taxes for needful things. What a lot of people don't like is paying taxes to build bombs that we drop on people on the other side of the planet we've never met. And generally, it's the corporations that are benefiting, not us. Taxes, when I buy gas or I buy food, I'm paying for taxes for that. It's not so much the tax that we have a problem with, it's what's done with the tax money afterwards.
Now, police are concerned with your movement. In fact, police in BC and as well as here in Toronto, they're being briefed about your organization.
Yeah.
I know that the U.S. has labeled you a domestic terrorist group. What do you think about that?
I think it's pretty ludicrous that the moment you start questioning the government, the source, nature, and limits of government authority, they automatically come out and start labeling you as a potential domestic terrorist threat. Using words and bringing love, compassion, and truth, I don't think are the actions of a terrorist. And for the most part, the people down in the States, the sovereign movement, from what I understand, there are people down there who have, unfortunately engaged in violence. I don't know of any Freemen in Canada who advocate violence. If you really wanted to define it, it's a spiritual libertarianism more than anything.
But you mentioned the violence, and especially in the United States. I mean, people are talking about when it comes to Freemen, it's about access to firearms. Why associate yourselves with them if you want to have a different philosophy?
It's not us associating ourselves with them. It's the government associating us with that and saying that we are like them when in fact we're not.
It's interesting, though. You were in the military.
I love my country.
And I'm just wondering how you came to be a part of the Freeman Society, because the military, you probably have to have a lot of ID. You're working for the government, with the government. How'd you make that transition, and why?
I made the transition because I was subjected to an unlawful action by government agents. I was denied access to the courts. I was unhappy, and most people who come to this movement come to it because they feel they have been dishonored on some level by the government agent, by a police officer overstepping what they feel are the lawful bounds. We then start looking into these words, doing the research, and starting to realize that there's a whole lot of deception involved in these words, and for a large degree, their authority is not just natural, it requires actions on our part which grants them the consent.
Now, Rob, a lot of people would look at Canada as one of the most democratic societies in the world. Yeah. Some people might say that they understand that you don't want your money used to drop bombs, but income tax also goes to pay for your health care, it goes to pay for your roads and the infrastructure that you use on a daily basis here in the country.
I understand that, and that's a very good point, and I thank you for raising it. However, we had all of these things prior to the implementation of income tax. And a lot of the income tax money also goes to foreign bankers because in order to pay for these things, we actually float a bond, sell that bond on the market, then we have to pay the money back with interest attached. The government has the right and the power to spend that money into circulation right off the bat without any of those things. I believe that we do certain things I would recognize that we have an obligation to pay for. But income tax, for instance, I imagine you have a social insurance number.
Yeah, like everybody in this country.
I know, and yet if you read the act under which you applied for that number, you find that it identifies you as a federal employee, and they call it your federal employee identification number. You need it to get a Canada pension plan, and if you want to access welfare or employment insurance or Canada pension plan, then that you need that. We've looked at it and we've decided that the payoff isn't there. I mean, if you are asked to give up certain rights and freedoms in exchange for certain benefits, but you don't know what rights and freedoms you've given up, how do you know what you're receiving is in fact
what rights and freedoms do you give up by virtue of having a social insurance number?
Well, then once you become an employee of the federal government, you're bound by the rules that bind all employees of the federal government. And if you choose to not be a federal employee, then you're not bound by those rules. So such things like the Income Tax Act. You're not bound by that act unless you do have a social insurance number. You're not obliged to have one.
How do you travel? How did you even travel from BC to here?
I exercise my right to access the highways as mentioned in the Criminal Code of Canada, and I get in a vehicle and I go from point A to point B.
But without a license?
Without a license.
How do you support yourself? How do you get a job?
I do masonry work and I operate under contract, lawful contract. There's nothing that says you need a social insurance number in order to engage in lawful contracts.
What about changing the rules instead of not abiding by them? And if everyone, for example, if everyone lived by that notion, some argue that this could be a lawless society in a way.
Leslie, your question is based upon the assumption that we are disobeying the rules, but that's not the case. What we do is we actually look at the rules, and instead of assuming that they're applicable, we find that, oh no, they're not applicable unless you engage in certain actions, so we don't engage in those actions, so those rules aren't applicable.
Rob, we have to wrap up, but if you can just in a sentence explain to me what it is ultimately that you hope your group achieves.
I would like to see that the rights and the freedoms that our forefathers fought, killed, and died for are respected and exercised and are there for future generations.
Well, it's an ongoing thing you'll be seeing in the papers as far as the situation that you run into with the police in BC and here as well. Rob Menard, Director of the World Freeman Society, thanks for coming in and explaining it to us.
Thank you for having me.
7:20.